Greetings, Kingswood family. Imagine there was a sports match on City Lords and you had your chair and you were coming to try and find a spot in amongst the crowd, and you found some people and you said, hey, can I put my chair, can I sit with you? And they go, yes, sure, you can sit with us. And so you would be sitting in that group. Or imagine, in fact, we had a little sleepover on City Lords, and we had tents in various groups, and you would pitch up and you would come and have your tent, and you would find some people and you'd say, hey, could I pitch my tent here? And they'd say, sure. And so you'd pitch your tent and you would stay there with them for the evening and for the function. What am I going on about? Well, that's the story of Christmas, isn't it? Not about sports matches or camping on City Lords. It's about God coming to pitch his tent among human beings. God stepped out of his God-likeness and became a human, took on human flesh, and we have the story of Christmas. And then we journey through Jesus' teachings, and at this time now, as we've come through Lent, we get to Easter. And so often we would get to the place where we go, well, Jesus died on the cross for my sins, and that's why I can go to heaven, and it sounds very, who goes to heaven? And that's not the point. That's not the main point. It's not about God trying to take us out of earth or to rescue us and we say some magic prayer so that we can one day go to heaven when we die. Now, I want you to notice that in Jesus going to the cross, there was so much more happening. Now, we don't have time to unpack the whole thing. I know some of you have already checked to see how long this video is before you decided to watch it. So just a few comments. Here we have an innocent man who is arrested and tortured and nailed to a Roman cross. And so we see in that a whole bunch of things. We see Jesus facing injustice, an innocent man being executed. We see before that Jesus was betrayed by Judas, one of his closest disciples. We see loneliness. He was deserted by his friends. We see pain. We see suffering, and we see death. And that's Good Friday, but then fortunately, it doesn't end there. Now, before we hurry to Easter, which we tend to do and skip over the darkness and the death of Good Friday, we need to pause there because we face it, don't we? We wouldn't think that we would still be back. We didn't. We thought we might be over this pandemic in some way or form, but it's still with us. And even things not related to COVID, there are people that are struggling within themselves, struggling with family relationships, broken relationships. They have loved ones who are dying of cancer or of some illness. We have people who live far away. There is a lot of pain, there's a lot of grief. And so in Jesus dying on the cross, in the victory of him rising again, we see something that gives us hope. As N.T. Wright says, Jesus dies embodying God's justice crushed by injustice, incarnating God's love rejected by human hatred, God's freedom dying the death of a slave, God's beauty defaced, marred beyond imagining, God's truth in the world of lies, God's power in human weakness, God's presence in the paradox of apparent God-forsakenness. Jesus thus establishes what the scriptures had promised, the living God coming back at last to dwell in the midst of his people and to reveal his love, his innermost character as this God of utter self-giving love. Richard Rohr says that there are two things that transform the human heart: great love and great suffering. And in fact, if you love someone or you love greatly, you will suffer at some point. And those of you that are older would know that. To love means that at some point you suffer, but it's still worth it. And isn't it interesting that in the cross we see those two coming together? We see great love and we see great suffering. But then we know that Jesus was victorious, that Jesus stamped out death and pain and suffering. So, where does that leave us when we still wrestle with these things, when we still live in a pandemic, when we still have loved ones that are ill? Well, it means that there are no easy answers. It means that there's no academic theory. It just means that we have a God that pitched his tent, that came into our space and time, that came into our suffering. We have a God that sits with us, that knows death, but is victorious over death. And so as you celebrate Easter, as we reflect on the meaning of the cross, can I invite you to sit at the cross? And as you sit at the cross, whatever your pain may be, to know that Jesus is with us with nail-scarred hands, that He took on suffering, He took on pain, He came among us, but He overcame those things. So our hope is that death does not have the final say, that one day things will be better, that there is hope and even joy in Christ, because He was victorious over those things. It seems like it, but it is not the final word. Jesus' death and resurrection means that He has set us free to become the human beings that God has created us to be. He has set us free to be really alive. And as I close, let me say this. He has invited us to continue to bring heaven to earth. Just as He pitched His tent among us, just as He came to live among us, He invites us to help bring heaven to earth. That we would be bearers of His image, that we would bring hope, that we would bring joy, that by faith we would encourage people around us. And so I invite you to that as well. God is alive. Jesus is risen. And that's great news.
So much has changed since last Easter. The world has been shaken. Life has been disrupted. What we once called normal seems like it may never return. It's been easy to be discouraged, to lose hope, to feel the foundations of our faith begin to crumble. It's hard to keep our feet planted when the ground beneath feels like shifting sand. Now more than ever, we need to stand on the truth of Easter, a day which changed our eternity, changed our world forever. Death was defeated by life. Sin was consumed by mercy. The grave was swallowed up by victory. See, even in the darkest of moments, the love of Jesus could not be stopped. His faithfulness could not be broken. And when the dust settled, Jesus, He stood alive and victorious. Today, may we remember the truth of Easter, the power of the resurrection, and the promise of eternity. Yes, the world has been shaken, but the grave, it's still empty. And Jesus, He's still risen.